Welcome to the Cloud Cost Optimization webinar, the next step in CC Pace's series where we work to share useful insights with our network. For those of you that joined Joe Fuqua's talk on generative AI, thank you. This is going to be completely different. Today, I'm joined by a few friends and former colleagues. I'd like to welcome Donny Momchilov. Donny's a cloud architect practicing across a series of clients that he works with here in the Chicago area where I live. Welcome, Donny. Thanks for joining. Bruno Courbage is joining us as a SVP of product management at a vertically focused SaaS provider. He and I worked together in the past in product management extensively, and we're very familiar with actually driving these costs down and what the effects can be on your product roadmap. Thank you for joining us, Bruno. And finally, last but not least, is Deepak Panigraphy, who's now the CEO of a fast-growing startup in cloud cost optimization. They're out of the UK. They're working globally. They're called Digiusher. Deepak, thank you very much for joining. Gentlemen, overall, thank you for joining. I appreciate it. So as we get started, the cloud providers are getting 30% margins by everybody's measure. And yet 60% of companies, large and small, say the reason they're moving to the cloud is to be able to contain and save on costs. Can both of those be true in the long run? Well, I think the answer to that really depends on the specific workload. In today's discussion, we're going to talk through some trends, specific tips, and then a few techniques to keep these costs under control. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there's actually a word for buyer's remorse in the cloud world. It's called repatriation, and there have been more than a few massive examples if anybody's interested. So we've all been working at this from a variety of angles over the years. The bulk of my experience is as a straight-through processing 24/7, 3 to 4 nines availability software provider that moved from its own private data centers to a public cloud strategy. One thing I can say for certain is that there's much to be learned on the job about the intricacies of your cloud contract after actual use occurs. We had a team dedicated to monitoring and driving down the expense through a series of product releases and made quite a bit of progress, sometimes hand in hand with the cloud vendor, sometimes not. One thing I've learned is that if you have quick, significant changes in volume on, say, Black Friday, you cannot rely on the auto scale to work as fast as you need it to. In short, it just isn't instantly elastic enough if you are cost conscious. So you'll need to set aside that excess capacity in advance and then wind it down. For those that aren't cost conscious, of course, I envy you, but there's a ton of ways to be looked at right there. Another point I'd like to make is around needing to pay someone else to pay your cloud provider to have access to your own data. Have you seen the AWS snowmobile? That's the semi-truck that comes by to help you offload, then upload your 100 petabytes of data. The salesman in me sees that and thinks that truck is certain to deliver an unfavorable long-term contract at the end of its trip. So as we look at this, cost of compute is certainly continuing its march downward, where the long-term trend was an order of magnitude every 4 years. Now it's an order of magnitude every 12 years. But the cloud providers provide a lot more than compute. And we all know that inflation has been up lately. And also, if you're an analytics-oriented company, the order of magnitude of the problems that you're actually putting in the cloud has increased significantly as well. So I've heard from Deepak as a prep for this discussion that one of the selling points around cost containment and reduction is made much easier because unit prices are going up by some 15% year on year across the cloud providers across the globe. I'd like to check in now and see if Bruno has anything he'd like to add on costs from his perspective and what he's seeing.
We're talking about cloud costs as an item. It implies a transition from, at a business level, thinking about infrastructure as a fixed cost to thinking about it as a variable cost. And what does that mean from a technical standpoint? That means that as a fixed cost, by the very nature of how organizations were and sometimes still are running their IT infrastructure, there was or is an enormous amount of waste. So the transition from these kind of legacy fixed scalable infrastructures over to public clouds like, whether it's Google, Amazon, or Azure, is creating an opportunity to decrease the overall spend. Choosing my words very carefully here, right? By squeezing the balloon, right? That's what's going on. Is they're squeezing the balloon, they're eliminating the inefficiencies. And so that gets us to the actual cost conversation. The cost conversation, Deepak, I think you framed it extremely well. Unit prices are going up. But does that mean that organizations are spending more in aggregate as they're moving from these legacy infrastructures or squeezing the air out of the balloons on existing cloud-based infrastructure products? And so I actually think that there's potentially still a lot of opportunity to become more effective and efficient in how applications are architected, instrumented, managed, observed, etc. In the cloud. And we could continue to see overall expense decreases as we squeeze out the air from the balloon.
Yeah.
While at the same time, the cloud providers are raising their prices. So to me, this is a huge opportunity, and I'm not sure that we're past the point in aggregate in the industry where we don't have any more air left to squeeze out of the balloon. If you're in that position, I congratulate you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the unit costs don't necessarily tie to aggregate costs increasing, right? That's a very good point. And I think just out of the gate, the cloud providers, they hadn't provided cloud cost monitoring tools that were particularly strong only a few years ago, but they've started to provide these, right? I know where I worked in the past, we had a whole organization tracking and making sure we knew who had created an instance and whether we're shutting it down, et cetera. But I think those tools have dramatically improved. And so I'd be curious, just out of the gate, using the cloud vendors tools, right? Donny, right? Are these tools up to the task, right? Can you get a lot done? Can you get most of the job done with the vendor provided tools? I think the auto scale and cloud cost optimization capabilities within AWS, for example. What are your thoughts?
It absolutely does. And you actually framed it pretty nicely, Tim, is that a couple of years ago, these tools were kind of an afterthought. They weren't really seen as useful. It's like they were very high level. You never could get down into like the nitty gritty of like, what am I really paying for? Like, what am I seeing? But over the years, what's nice, like within Azure and within AWS specifically, you have Cost Explorer within AWS and you have cost management within Azure. But it's nice because like maybe you're looking at an account level and you want to see at a broad scale what everything looks like, but then you want to go into like, or maybe from Azure, you want to go into like the resource level. What do those high level costs look like? And you can literally dive into each piece. You can look into your EC2 instance, for example, or you can look into a VM instance, or you can start looking into your different databases that are in there, and you can see the utilization and what the utilization looks like. Who is your biggest offender can actually be brought into the reporting. What does it look like? And you can do this. You can do this daily. This is not like you go in there and it's like a monthly thing. As you're looking at it, it can be almost real time. But any of the exports that come out, if you wanted to report it out to anyone within your organization, that's usually a daily export is what it really helps inform some of like the cost that's coming out of there. But I mean, you can really get really deep into like not only compute cost, memory cost, but like code inefficiency. You can actually see it. And what's really nice, what's starting to roll out a little bit more is that specifically in AWS, they're actually turning this little corner and they're actually giving you an idea. Like, hey, listen, you have over provisioned this service. And this over provisioning is costing you X amount of dollars based on your utilization. Let's scale that back. And then it gives you a chance to kind of scale it back and you get this 30-day, projection of what it's going to look like. And then you can decide like, oh, this does make sense. Or maybe maybe you over provisioned on purpose. Right. And that doesn't make sense because, within the next 15 days, like your usage is going to explode on whatever service it is. But at the very least, you have that. That information is there for you the second you spin up any of your new subscriptions from an Azure perspective, or a new account from an AWS perspective. So, and then GCP has, I hate to say it, but they're not nearly as robust from their reporting perspective. But I'd say most of the people are really using Azure and AWS, so that's kind of why, if you notice, I keep steering my conversation down that path. But I think over the next few years, GCP has been catching up on a lot of these things quickly too, especially within the last couple of years. But there's still, from a cost perspective, you're not getting the same information that is available to you within Azure and AWS at this point.
Bruno, do you use those tools now in your world?
Yeah, so my experience with the hardcore cloud provider tools is a few years old. Donny, I'm sure your experience is much more recent than mine on this. And as far as my experience was, they were still at the starter kit stage, right? Sure. I think though, I want to kind of just do a quick double click on something you said, Donny, which was around code optimization. Because where we found recently, and we're talking about the past 18 months here, is that the observability of our cloud usage footprint was good. And I would say good enough, right? With a combination of what we have from the cloud provider and some of our own tooling. But where we've actually found the most opportunity has been on the code optimization capabilities, right? So thinking about it, like, I'm sure our audience here has all heard of the infrastructure as code paradigm, where really the deployment of the infrastructure is part of the actual software development and operationalization initiative. The implication of that is that we've found that we've needed to go up higher into the stack, higher into the code, in order to really figure out where our expense drivers were or are. And for that, we've had to use tools like Datadog, right? Prometheus in certain cases, to actually be able to look at the API level, what is happening here. This API response time is very slow. It's leading to the execution of this service that's costing us a certain amount. So it's being able to actually go all the way from the back of the stack, the execution, the cost, the bill we get from AWS, all the way to the lines of code that are being executed through the business process the customer is experiencing. So I've found that the back end tools, the cloud providers are good for the back end observability, but we've needed to go up the stack into the code, and they haven't done a good enough job in that sense.
Fascinating. I'll throw my next question to Deepak. I was reading Andreessen Horowitz, the study, I think a couple of years ago, they did this fantastic study on cloud costs, and it just sort of casually mentioned in there, and I would just highlight to everybody, if you haven't read this, it's very much worth the read. And it's talking about large entities and how they really should be thinking about cloud costs and what they're paying for them. But it casually mentions third-party optimization tools that can provide quick gains to existing systems are ranging from 10 to 40% our experience observing this space. So, Deepak, I'm curious, is that how you see it? The 10 to 40%? You're a third-party tool provider, right? I think you're rapidly growing. What's your spiel for when those sort of classic, standard tools the cloud providers themselves provide aren't enough, right? And how do you provide more edge beyond that?
The first thing that we actually are trying to do differently here, Tim, is actually to look at the real cost and usage data from each of the cloud providers. Now, as Donny said, that some of the native tools that have been provided by the cloud providers are good enough, but still lack a lot of in-depth analysis that is actually needed. So to give you a perspective, and I want to add to what Bruno said as well. There are 4 pillars, Tim, where eventually if the customer has to really, really optimize, they need to focus on. The first is infra, which is a very, very no-brainer. It's like identifying the patterns and saying that, underutilized, not utilized, potentially shut down. move to a spot, what's the migration opportunities? It is like a kind of right sizing opportunities, I would say. Okay. Those are like, I feel the first low hanging fruits everybody should be jumping. But the real game actually starts on the next three pillars. Number one, as Bruno said, going back to the engineering level and at the product level to understand that what exactly is going on. Okay, and this is very, very essential, Tim, and we have seen that in the last 6 months with one of the clients. What they've done is, with the kind of organization they built, okay, and the visibility and the unit economics that started to bring about, they actually saw a feature that is costing them a lot is actually offered as a standard feature. Okay, but it's costing a lot to them, more than in fact what the whole bundle of the standard offering was actually. Right, and then so they had got to only two options. Either they start optimizing that and see that how that code level actually can decrease, because we don't understand what's running on the resources, but we can actually tell them that, okay, this set of resources, if you can actually manage the solution right, it can pinpoint to exact particular kind of a feature or a functionality which is actually costing you, let's say, X dollars, right? So they went on to embarking the journey that how they can reduce the cost of that, and they actually came about reducing that particular feature by almost slashing by 70% the cost.
Wow.
So that's the second pillar, the product strategy I will put in. The third thing that I would put in is the way there are, the customers can actually start asking for their discounts. That's where I would say, one, that if you can't see it, if you can't understand it, you can never negotiate it.
That's for sure. Yeah.
So the more visible you are, and you know that what your real-time data is, what it actually provides back to you, and which you can understand when you are sitting in front of the vendor for the negotiations. That's when the third layer actually comes into the impact. Okay, and finally is actually the negotiating capabilities at the procurement side. So I would say these four pillars are the building blocks for the optimization journey. If they don't come together, Tim, it's a half journey or a half-baked cake which is being served. I mean, okay, you can eat it. Yes. That's how I would put that up.
I got it. And then how big does a client's spend need to be where you think a third-party tool is going to be paying off dividends, right? What should their annual spend be when they should be thinking, I really ought to get more horsepower that I'm throwing at this?
Okay, there could be, multiple people might have multiple perspectives around this, but what we are seeing, to be honest, with our ICPs as we are more discovering it, I feel the third-party tool starts coming into play once you cross like $1 million or $2 million of spending annually.
Annual spend $1 million.
And then if you're multi-cloud, you're using Kubernetes, you're actually doing a lot of orchestration. Now, none of the cloud providers give the depth of like how the clusters can be, let's say, optimized. Because then you have to build on something else, right? So if all that knowledge can be combined together, that's where the game starts changing. Okay. So I would say currently anybody on that range of $1 million, $1.5 million plus, well, they should actually start looking at a third-party tool to see that. And they are going multi-cloud. I feel the quicker you embrace the third-party tool where you can consolidate all your analysis, build guardrails, can figure out your chargebacks and showbacks. I feel that it will start showing you the results as the product and the growth of the company matures.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I like that $1 million cutoff. Just out of curiosity, how's business, right? You're a CEO of a startup, right? I think there's some nervous times as you get it off the ground, right? But how's it going, right? How is business?
It's good. It's very promising. We see that this landscape is still not mature, still maturing, as Donny said. Everybody is trying to catch up. I feel the biggest thing that we are observing here is, and which we are very much focused on, how to enable engineers to look at the cost when they're writing codes and maintaining the codes. If engineers can't see it, they can't do the right implementation that needs to be.
Right.
So in a nutshell, if I had to give, there's a lot of feedback coming and we're growing pretty fast, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay. So anybody here listening and want to try us out, I would be happy to at least, get onboarded to at least, provide them a tooling mechanism to see that how they can and what they can do.
Yeah.
I feel this is going to mature along. I feel that the cloud has already, if I'm not wrong, they've already crossed the cloud public spend has actually crossed now $600 billion annually now on a global scale.
Right.
If I'm correct, then in the next 2 years, definitely we'll cross the $1 trillion mark in the expenditures. So that's going to be an opportunity for us.
Yeah, certainly a growing market. Well, congratulations on your growth related to that. So appreciate it. So Donny, right? You and I were having lunch maybe a month ago. And you just sort of casually mentioned that a lot of times when you first meet a client, right, you can spend an hour or two and just sort of dive in and find some serious savings. I'm curious, right? You probably had some crazy stories where you checked in with somebody and you're like, oh my, right? They left the door to the store open. And maybe you could share a few tips and tricks as a practitioner. I'd love to hear more about that. And what did you say, 10K in an hour? I think I get what you said, but you thought you could save some serious money. Maybe you could just share a little bit more of the details of how you do that.
Sure. No, I mean, over the years, consulting being like my primary background, like I've gotten to go into like a significant amount of different organizations kind of look at spend from, just an infrastructure standpoint, an enterprise information architecture standpoint, cloud architecture standpoint. But what we always find and what we always go for first is we kind of go for those low-hanging fruit items. Like, what's the most expensive thing that you're spending money on? And inevitably, we always get back to some sort of bloat code that we will see that is always, that's overcomplicating certain things. And we kind of dive in there and we're like, hey, listen, we can start here, help optimize some of this stuff, and then we can kind of, build this out or kind of like explode out and like see what other things are out there that kind of help, to save costs. I mean, let's see, one of my favorite examples was with a healthcare provider, and they were actually going from, on-prem to off-prem to the cloud. And what they didn't realize is how wildly expensive like their dev environment had become, because that's where we went into dev as like their staging area initially before we built their QA staging process. So we didn't even build the promotion. We were just kind of like, hey, let's get in here. Let's show you what it looks like. And instantly we spun up all the services, we migrated everything up, and the second we did that, like their costs went boom through the roof. And they're like, whoa, what's going on? And then we had to dial it back and we're like, listen, this is where, we shut down services, but on an effort to kind of be like, listen, this is where your most expensive thing is. And for them, it was data processing. They had unfortunately, they were using SQL Server and they were moving into like a SQL Server service in the cloud. This was a few years ago before people were really starting to look at Snowflake as a true solution from a database perspective. But showing them like, listen, your stored procedures are looking crazy. I mean, when you have a stored procedure that's 5,000 lines, that's an inefficient stored procedure, right? Because there's so many different parts of it. And we'd have to kind of go there and like kind of walk them through what it looks like on-prem and what what the memory usage looked like, what the compute usage looked like, and you own all that. So it doesn't really matter to you. You can kind of spin up, spin down, kind of like, that's why you had a DBA to help you with that. But they didn't realize like, all right, when we go up here, we need to skinny all this down. We need to clean this stuff up. And it took upwards, and unfortunately, I mean, this was a few years ago, but it still took about a year for us to kind of get to that point where we were able to optimize the code and then optimize the services that they needed in an effort to give them what they really wanted. at a cost that was, within a budget that they'd kind of set aside for it. And then we built the applications on top of it, and then the API calls that kind of came out of it, and then the trafficking and all that fun stuff kind of came after that. But I mean, that's one of them. I really wanted to go back though to what Deepak said about negotiations, and I had a very good experience with this, and it's specifically with Azure, with the financial services company. So we had built this, this massive product, within this company. And at one point, we were starting to we were creeping up to that $1 million+ mark of spend. And I was, thankfully enough, I had a really good relationship with our Microsoft representatives, and I was able to bring them in, and we would show them hey, I'm here's the architecture that we're thinking of. This is what we're planning on. And as I'm presenting the architecture, I'm talking to the developers, being listen, we can't use, at that time, uSQL was kind of a thing that they were experimenting, that we started experimenting with, to kind of be all right, let's ensure that this code base is looking better, or that these procedures are looking better, or this, before DevOps was really DevOps, Azure had 2 different ways of deploying code, but making sure everything was in an efficient way, that when we went back to Microsoft, listen, this is what we have, these are the steps, this is what our code base looks like. And when they really sat and took the time to understand what we were looking for, but then they were very interested in becoming more partners, wanted to share code more and use some of our stuff as as examples of hey, we negotiated with these guys, and they're a true partner of ours. And then they were able to use some of the examples that we showed from an efficiency standpoint to show, hey, this is how you drive costs down. But even back then, the idea of cost optimization was a thought, but not understood until we were this is how we're figuring it out. This is what we've determined to be our way of solving it. And I've just kind of used that mentality as I've kind of gone along. But yeah, I mean, it's these kind of examples of leveraging code properly, leveraging functions or lambdas, better, but skinnying it down. I mean, simplicity is gold at this point. And I live by that, and I have for years, because at any one point, if someone leaves, you want to be able to transition. And I mean, the transition is a cost in and of itself, right? But if you can cut that cost and cut cloud costs, I think you really end up as a whole saving money, and as a whole truly getting to the heart of from just being financially secure, financially stable, financially healthy. And I mean that those are all important things.
Could you go a little further in the lambdas comment? You just said leveraging lambdas. Go a little further if you would on that.
No, sure. The code. So what's nice about lambdas, and same thing with functions in Azure, right? I mean, you can have them create a bunch of different things with different types of code base to do anything, right? You can have them spin up, spin down services. I mean, you can create thresholds within them. You can do, you can pull in Python libraries to do certain different things. I mean, there are layers of functionality within these code bases. But when you start to build too many layers within these code bases, it becomes, again, bloated. And you can't just rely on one Lambda or one function to do everything. You have to almost step it out, create a process within these tools to allow spin up the service, do whatever quickly and efficiently, spin it down, be done with it, and then let's get to the next one. So it's almost as you're stepping through these different processes and these different things, because I mean, you can go horizontal or you can go vertical easily on these, with using these tools. But if you're spending too much time on a horizontal or vertical, you're going to start spending too much time, too much money on these things. And that's where the inefficiency comes into play. And then when you're troubleshooting and when you're spending more time, now all of a sudden you're wasting, it's a waste of money and effort, because I'm troubleshooting thousands of lines of code that's creating all of this extra spend. And now you're doing it not only in dev, and then trying to, we haven't even discussed this whole the DevOps part of it, but when you're doing it all in dev, and then all of a sudden that inefficient code gets pushed out in one way or another to your promoted environments, then you're starting to see even worse. And then it really kind of just expands out. So now you're not just seeing it in now one environment or one account, or one subscription. You're seeing it, or one resource group. You're seeing it across many, and that's why it really starts at the dev environment and really kind of going in there and finding that simplicity and really and for lack of a better term, just tightening it all up. Right. And then bringing it together before you can kind of move on and move up. And move up, meaning from just a promotion standpoint.
Well, and then just the sheer basics of it. How often do you check in with an AWS client where they haven't even used the custom budget function? They're not looking at the cost usage reports, right? Is that common that you find somebody who sort of let the thing adrift, or are people actually looking at those things on a daily basis?
Until you can show them hey, this is what you really should be looking at. People kind of let it go. They basically set a reminder, hey, go catch the budget, go grab it, pull down whatever the spend was, and submit it to finance and be done with it. That's literally how some of these people operate. And I mean, you can get a very detailed account of what's going on for both Azure and AWS, line by line, per region, per service, per whatever. And people just kind of blankly, they don't want to look at all of that, right? They don't want to look at it.
It's super complicated. I've been there myself. Yeah.
So, but you kind of educate them, look for these specific pieces.
Right.
And if you look at these specific pieces, you'll start to understand your budget a little more. You'll start to understand where your efficiencies might lie. I mean, there could be those false positives or the red herrings that are in there. But until you start looking into it, you won't know, or it won't ever spark that idea or interest. Oh my God, I need to look over here, not over here. But it's taken some time where I've had multiple clients where I've literally run that for 6 months. And I would circle certain things on paper, it hurts my heart to have printed anything. But sometimes the only way to show people what's going on is you have to physically show them, you're circling things and hey, this is where it is. This is where the issues are. Let's start here. And then we can kind of work our way back to other things, to other, products or ideas or, business processes, something, because there's other things that beget this, right? But if we start here, we can kind of work our way back or forward. Depends on where you are in the process.
Yeah, no, I like that. And you referenced to how the Azure team really wanted to help you. I mean, that was my experience. The AWS team where I was at before, they were wonderful in trying to help us. So it's just super sophisticated when you got into it, right? It's okay, what's actually happening here? How are these things interacting? And what do we do first was the big question, right? And how we sequence it. So maybe we sort of think about this a little bit differently, right? So if we think about cloud-based products, right, for building SaaS solutions that you're selling to others, I'm curious, Bruno, if you can share thoughts that you have related to this. I know when you and I have worked together in the past, right, we really thought a lot about cost up front and sort of saying, hey, these are the kind of typical usages. Let's make sure that they're inside of the build intention that we have. But you've been at this for a while now. I'm curious, how do you think about it, both as a product management head, but maybe also as a head of engineering? But how do you sort of build that into the way that you work with the teams that you have?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the fundamental work that a product manager needs to do is think about product requirements, both functional and non-functional. Because at the end of the day, it's through the thought processes that come with thinking about non-functional requirements that you're going to make sure you don't paint yourself into a corner. I think it was, I don't remember if it was Don or Deepak who said this earlier, but something that I learned quite early on in my product management career is I was building a whole new product, which you don't get to do as a product manager very often. Is that I actually started thinking about, well, what's my market? And in light of that market, what is my peak transaction volume going to look like? And I wrote this, I kind of did this analysis about, peak transaction volume and response time. So it was both response time and scaling. And that little paragraph that I wrote in a product requirements document many years ago got the engineering team, actually the QA team, okay, so what are the test cases that we have to put in there? And we actually uncovered enormous inefficiencies in the infrastructure that our product was being built on. Ever since then, I advocate to any and all product managers, think not only about your market in terms of what is the market I'm going after, how big is it, what's the TAM, how much can I charge for it, what's my competitive pressure, and all that good stuff that every product manager does with their eyes closed. But also, can this product actually be profitable?
Right.
Is the execution of this product going to cost more than I can actually make out of it? And that comes from asking the questions right up front. So in other words, I know that I'm going to make 100 a year from this product with the market, right, and the sales projections that I think we can achieve as an organization. And I know that I want X% gross margin. Let's say I want 78%, 80% gross margin, right? Yeah, I know. I can see your smile, Tim. We dream of those numbers from our past, right? So you want you want 80% gross margin or up something north of that.
Yeah.
And if you're going to try and get 80% gross margin, that means that that you've got this much that you can afford in terms of your cloud costs. So you've got to have the conversation with the engineering team, and you've got to stretch them.
Yeah.
Because if you don't stretch the engineering, tell them, look, explain, walk them through the thought process, they'll get it. Engineers are smart people, right? So product managers need to have that conversation with them. What are the scalability? What are the volume objectives? What are the cost constraints? And force them to think about how to architect the product, the feature, the solution. And you know what's going to happen? Exactly what Donny talked about 5 minutes ago. They're going to start simplifying the implementation of the solution to a point where it can be managed from a cost standpoint. You can handle staff churn. You can handle migration, multi-cloud much more effectively. You instrument observability throughout. So think about cloud costs, cloud usage, or infrastructure in general upfront, and set your constraints before you write a single line of code.
Right. For sure. The design principle I used to always joke about when I was in the software business was there's a reason why there's no Swiss Army chainsaw. Right.
That's right.
And the point there is that you can't have a multi-tool that actually is able to buzz at that kind of speed, right? So you might need transactional processing that's extremely optimized. The way that you'd actually enable that is very different depending on what the problem is, right? To be able to have it actually run efficiently at scale, right? So how do you actually identify what those things are up front? So maybe we could delve a little further in them. How do you think about a developer specifically taking action, what you said, right? So you're talking about KPIs, things like this that are down at the developer level where it's like, hey, not only are you building this, but here's the parameters that you're building it under, and my expectations that I'll be able to see these things when it comes time for testing and proofing.
Yeah, so I think from a developer standpoint, and I thank you for bringing that up, because that to me is one of the single most important, I would say, takeaways that I want our audience to walk away with what I have to say today. And that's that, in the past, Tim, when you and I were working with large engineering teams, the spend that we were seeing on cloud development expenses was, large, significant seven figures. And the reality is we've all got laptops today that are incredibly capable. And so I've actually pushed for the transition of engineers to perform much of their development on their local machines. Now, what has that prompted, right? And why would you do that, and why wouldn't you do that? Well, the challenge that creates is that it forces an organization to have excellent operational deployment capabilities. So in other words, if an engineer is going to spend 20 hours of time just creating the infrastructure on their laptop so that they can even start developing on it, that's highly inefficient. So you need to get to a point where that engineer can just push a button and set their laptop as the target deployment, and suddenly, miraculously, there it is. Here is my development environment for the product I'm working on my laptop. And I can start developing test, develop test locally, and then start working in cloud-based environments a little bit later in the development process. Saves a lot of money and makes the engineers a heck of a lot more profitable. But most importantly, what it does is it forces operational excellence on the deployment processes. And one of the things that I found when I joined the company that I work with today is, I was shocked at the fact that the service that we provide our clients is not multi-tenant. And to me, multi-tenancy was, the end all be all. You got to be multi-tenant. And what I came to realize is that actually I kind of like the fact that we're not multi-tenant. Not only, Tim, when you and I were working together, we experienced pushback from clients who didn't love the idea of having their very, very sensitive data commingled with other clients' data. And no matter what constraints we told them that we had put in place, which were very legitimate, right? It wasn't bogus. There still was a little bit of hesitancy. And to a certain extent, we would kind of have to swim upstream to complete the sales process with some of these security teams. Today, we're telling them, no. In my organization, we're telling them, you're a single tenant. You're completely cordoned off from anybody else. No data leakage risks, no of any kind. And the way we're able to achieve this is through deployment operational excellence, so that we can say, I am releasing, every 2 weeks or every week or every whatever, and I can release that with a push of a button, and it goes out to our entire customer community. Or it's an emergency patch that goes to one customer. Or it's a canary release that goes out to 5 customers before we release it to a broader community of customers. Oh, we just found a critical defect that's affecting one client that is using a very specific business process. Let me roll them back.
Hey, now you're bragging about CI/CD, Bruno. This is starting to get pretty rich here, right? I dream of an environment that you're in. That's fantastic. I love that, right? And I think it's the trick, right? Is being able to do that what you just described. Sorry to interrupt, but that's fantastic that you're in that place. The ability to do that is so critical.
I just want to throw one comment in there, and Bruno, I love that, because you've built a culture, and that culture is important, right? Of seeing it one way and approaching it that way. Unfortunately, for a lot of organizations, is that what we've noticed is that culture isn't built that way. It's built like, I want to see the most sophisticated, the most complicated, the most crazy idea, but never does that ever beget like saving more money. There's no cost optimization when it comes to that. But if you can build a culture that kind of like down to the code level, if you can build that culture in there, I think everyone just sees a much, like, not only like cost optimization, cost savings, whatever, but you see I think you see a happier workforce, because people are now almost like supporting each other to kind of help each other get there.
And they're more efficient, and they love that. They can see that they're more efficient.
I throw there, I think there's a trend that might relate to this as well, where larger clients are certainly trying to bring in this SDET role, software development engineer and test, right, where they're actually coders, heavily skilled Java coder that is actually involved with testing, but they're thinking about it end to end, right, in a way where it's not like just, hey, at the end we're going to actually run through and run the tests on Selenium or whatever, right? They're actually contemplating the whole time through what they might do related to it. But yeah, I love that story, Bruno, about where it's headed. I think it's the market's moving quickly, right? People are sort of seeing what makes the most sense to be able to deploy, right? If you have to deploy out to 20, 30, 50, 60, 70 instances, right? Boy, oh boy, you can lose a PI, you can lose a sprint, you can lose your job, right?
Right.
All these things.
Tim, on the SDAC comment, I think it's important, but Donny, you planted the seed in my head about 10, 20 minutes ago. We've actually started doing something in our organization where our cloud operations teams are engineers. They're actual coders, right? And so what they've done is they've coded systems to monitor changes in expense and usage patterns and actually generate alerts. So we don't find out that suddenly a service usage has gone through the roof, costing us, $5,000, $10,000 a day. 20 days after the fact? No, we find out after 3 days or 2 days or 3 hours, depending on how we've configured it and how the thresholds are. So I would also encourage the audience to look at it that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so we're rapidly running out of time here. I'm gonna do a round robin to conclude here, and I think the round robin question is, if you could go back in time 5 years, right? What would you tell yourself about, what would be the thing that you wish you knew about the cloud, right? And this joking discussion is, what would you tell yourself about the markets? And somebody said, well, I would have told myself, Bitcoin's going to make it to whatever thousand. What is it that you'd love to have known 5 years ago about the cloud, and what would that be? So, anybody care to answer that question?
I'll give you a one-liner. Okay, go ahead, Donny.
Yeah. No, but what I would have probably told myself is just be more patient with it. Mm-hmm. Don't rush into anything. I feel like this idea of the cloud, everything needs to be spun up and it needs to be ready to go right away. And it really is more just take a step back, take a breath, really architect the solution properly, and then go down this path of coding it. That's what I probably would have told myself.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Very similar. You can't lift and shift into the cloud.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a very common term that you use, Bruno. Lift and shift doesn't apply. I would add one thing to here. It's like if I have to go back 5 years, mm-hmm. I would always think that when I get a salary, when I'm working for somebody, right? How do I run my home? Mm-hmm. So if that constraint comes in, then the thought process actually derives the whole team to start thinking differently, which Bruno and Donny both covered. Mm-hmm. Right. So if there is an unlimited thing and everybody sees that, okay, we have the cloud, which is the sky is the limit and everything is available, the whole mm-hmm. attitude is different. Mm-hmm. The moment everybody you tell us, you have $100 and you have to spend within the $100, the attitude mm-hmm. is different and the approach mm-hmm. changes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I have to go back 5 years, I would say that numbers probably should come from us to everybody down the team to tell them that, guys, this is how you need to execute. Mm-hmm. Go beyond, we should have a right logic and why we are actually doing so and what's the reason behind that.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Well, Bruno, Deepak, Donny, I really appreciate your time getting on this panel and chatting. For the attendees or people listening to this recorded, we appreciate your time as well. Hopefully this has been informative to you. And we'd love to chat and interact, right? The Friends of CC Pace grows by the day, and we appreciate everybody's time and involvement. Thank you, gentlemen. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye for now.